Third day, upper wind month, 1 CE. A sharp intake of breath greeted Ludmilla as she stepped out of the gate and onto the teleportation gazebo in Irantal's central district. She furrowed her brow at the noise, finding a quivering noblewoman fearfully covering her rounded belly with pale, slender arms. Her maids quivered in unison to either side. Ludmilla frowned at the noblewoman's two footmen, who had taken cover behind the maids. What was the point of having an escort if they hid behind their mistress? She resisted the urge to check over herself for entrails, bloodstains or anything else that might lend a fearful appearance before fixing her face into a pleasant smile. "Good afternoon, Countess Valkenheim." "Gigi, good morning, Baroness Saradnik." "Is your lord husband well?" Ludmilla asked. "I'm surprised to find you here, considering the season." "The season? Ah, our fields are sown in the winter." "That's right, I apologize, my lady. I suppose my mind has been filled with my own affairs. It feels like I've been away for far too long." Unlike Warden's Vale, which was nestled in the highlands southwest of Irantal, the lowland territories of the interior didn't have to wait for the warmer weather of spring to unfreeze the ground. This made winter maintenance and preparations for the next growing season a somewhat relaxed affair. The pregnant woman shifted away on the grass where she was seated as Ludmilla came closer to speak with her. What did she think she was going to do? Ludmilla was not wearing armor, neither was she wielding a weapon. There wasn't even a weapon visible on her person. If anything, she was the least visibly armed person in the duchy, while everyone at least had a dagger sheathed at their belts and noblemen and footmen usually had more substantial armament. Ludmilla's weapons were in the infinite haversack at her left hip. "What about yourself, my lady? How are you feeling? How is the baby?" She thought to divert the Countess' attention to happier matters, but Ludmilla fought to keep another sort of concern from her voice. Adelia Valkenheim was 15 years old and 6 months pregnant. While she understood that this was normal for followers of the Four, with family life commonly starting as early as 14, she also couldn't help but think that it wasn't a good thing. They were still growing children at that age. How could they be expected to bear and raise children themselves? The faith of the Six was far more sensible. Humans couldn't be considered proper adults until they were 20. Children should be doing children's things, such as patrolling the wilderness and fighting off invaders or destroying undead in the Katsa Plains. Lady Valkenheim paled. Ludmilla put her smile back on, but it didn't appear to help. The pregnant noblewoman's hand went up, clutching blindly at one of her maids. "We're fine," she said as she was helped to her feet. "Thank you for your concern, my lady. Please excuse me, I was just taking a short rest after lunch and I've stayed overly long." "Of course, my lady." Ludmilla lowered her head politely. "Please convey my greetings to your lord husband." The Countess nodded once before scurrying away with her retinue. They smoothly wove around a passing patrol of Death Series servitors, looking far less frightened of the country-destroying contingent than they were of her. Was she truly that terrifying? Ludmilla silently shook her head, then stopped. In the distance, a group of maids whispered to one another with fearful looks. A sigh escaped her lips. Cities just weren't her thing. Every word, gesture and action was weighed, measured and added to some incomprehensible cocktail of political calculation. Irantal slowly returning to normal also meant that aspect of city life was also returning to normal. She concealed her presence as she left the gardens. It was better that people didn't see her at all. Blossoms danced over the city streets as she made her way across the front of the royal villa. Spring was well underway in Irantal, but she suspected that the uncharacteristically sunny weather was due to Lord Mayor. Though there was no need to catch up with a delayed harvest as they had last year, the Dark Elf Druid decided that it wouldn't hurt to lightly tweak the growing seasons to prevent flooding, drought or other forms of crop-damaging weather. The result was that conditions were more regular and mild. Ludmilla walked through the central district, unnoticed by the household staff performing errands or the citizens passing through. There were quite a few more active noble households than she had expected, and she wondered why that was. Most of them should have been out in their territories. Her pulse quickened as she approached the former mayor's manor, now the residence of the Sorcerer King in the capital. She gave her head a shake, touching the tips of her fingers to her collarbone. As far as she knew, His Majesty was supposed to be in the Holy Kingdom. There was no point in getting excited over the chance of a fortunate encounter. Ludmilla stopped at the front of the lane, where a wooden container marked suggestions had replaced the letterbox. She withdrew a binder from the infinite haversack at her right hip, glancing between it and the narrow slot of the box. "Well, that isn't going to fit," she muttered. It wouldn't do to just leave it on top of the box. She had more to add, besides. Recalling something that Lady Sholtier had mentioned, she reached out to wiggle the lock keeping the latch shut. A blade appeared at her throat. "By order of His Majesty, the suggestion box is—" "Oh, you really did show up." Ludmilla turned to address the previously undetectable Hanzo guarding the suggestion box. "I have a suggestion, but it doesn't fit. Would you be so kind as to deliver it to His Majesty when he returns?" She held out the binder between them. You are capable of performing this service, yes?" "Of course." The Hanzo took the binder into his hand. It disappeared into his inventory. Ludmilla pulled out a box containing a half-dozen more folders. The stealthy sentry eyed the container held out between them. What is this?" "Supplementary materials referenced by the suggestion," Ludmilla replied. "So His Majesty isn't inconvenienced by having to search for copies himself." A moment passed before the Hanzo took the box as well. Then she handed him another box. Ludmilla's suggestions were compiled over her time in the Empire and she wasn't sure if His Majesty would know what they referred to. From what she had seen, the Sorceress Kingdom's regular intelligence of the Empire was notably absent of many important things. Most of her suggestions required familiarity with that missing subject matter to appreciate. "These go with the suggestions," Ludmilla told the Hanzo, "so please ensure that they are directly received by His Majesty." "Ha!" The Hanzo straightened and offered a salute. "This one shall see this intelligence delivered even if it means this one's life." Ludmilla was relatively certain that the only person who could find and kill a Hanzo actively avoiding combat was Lady Aura. No one else could detect them if they were using conventional concealment. "Thank you very much," Ludmilla smiled. "Have you any idea when His Majesty will be returning, by the way?" The Hanzo shook his head. Ludmilla nodded and turned with a wave, continuing down the street. After observing the household servants moving about the district for some time, she believed she understood the cause of the uncharacteristic amount of activity. Spring, or at least the sowing season and the weeks of preparation that preceded it, was usually the second busiest time for nobles and their tenants. Not only was this regular, seasonal work labor-intensive, but 1,000 little things inevitably cropped up that demanded one's attention, causing endless minor delays and tying up resources. As Countess Volkenheim had mentioned, however, this season had long passed in the lowlands. Now, most nobles would have settled into the lull where they awaited the results of their management decisions. A large part of this lull would be filled by holding court with one's subjects. This meant going from village to village with one's retinue, holding audiences with villagers, performing inspections and getting a general feel for the state of their land. With the risk of demi-human raids, monster attacks and bands of brigands being a thing of the past, there was little excuse not to do so. Experiencing the improved yields and productivity over the past year also lent a sense of excitement to the nobility and they eagerly went from place to place trying to figure out how their unprecedented surplus revenues could be put to work. Unlike towns, which were purposely built a day's travel from one another, the distance between villages was based on how much land each could reasonably and safely manage. Normally, this was about as far as tenants and draft animals could travel in 2 hours, which was roughly 4 kilometers when one considered that they used the rural roads to go part way and then went to go wherever they were working out in the fields around their village. This meant that each village was roughly 8 kilometers apart. A lord with their itinerant court and its baggage train would spend about 4 hours traveling from one village to another. Ideally, a portion of the day was all that was needed to settle outstanding business that a village's chief couldn't handle. Taxes were collected at the same time, taking advantage of security that a noble brought with them. The remainder of the time in a village would be spent inspecting the settlement and its surroundings, discussing improvements or changes to the land and investigating potential problems. Lords would also hold feasts for the villagers to reinforce relations and foster a sense of local solidarity. Minor nobles were generally poor, so the feasts were usually limited to extra portions with nothing exotic or extravagant. Regardless, this practice led to the belief that nobles feasted every day, as commoners would see the noble throwing a feast for them and realize that they also threw a feast for the previous village and would be doing so for the next. In meager times, this perception would take a poor turn, framing nobles as those who ate well while everyone else starved. Assuming that there was nothing more to do at that village and if conditions permitted travel, the lord and his retinue would leave to repeat the process in the next village. The logistics of the itinerant court meant that the more territory a noble had under their direct management, the more time they spent traveling. A baron with 10 villages spent upwards of a month holding court. Most held court twice a year and this much was fairly manageable between a noble's other duties. The average count had anywhere between 20 and 40 villages. Holding spring and autumn court was still possible with 20, but, beyond that, a noble simply didn't have enough time. At that point, they resorted to one of 3 options. The traditional course was to sub-infeudate, creating a new title and infeoffing a baron or viscount. This would alleviate the burdens of rule at the cost of some tax revenues and certain rights within the new fief going to the vassal. These rights included collecting tolls, licensing industries, contracting tenants and creating bylaws. A second, similar action was to contract a knight. A knight's contract of vassalage supported a knight in their duties, which not only included the cost of equipment, training and support staff for their role as armed retainers, but also a seneschal and related staff for administrative tasks. The arrangement usually meant that no taxes went to the lord, but, in return, the lord had a professional warrior at their disposal. Depending on the productivity of the land, a knight needed 1 or 2 villages to support them, meaning that a count might opt to have 5 to 10 knights instead of a baron. Sensible nobles allocated about a third of their territory so they had powerful retainers available to enforce rule of law and immediately deal with threats to their territory. Lord Volkenheim's ranger retainer, Andrei, was an example of such a knight. Considering that the average, well-trained knight could be as strong as gold-ranked adventurers and better equipped, a noble would only need to hire adventurers for the direst of threats. This was, in effect, what the Empire did with the Imperial Army, though the process was more roundabout and centralized to consolidate martial power to the imperial throne. The final option, which grew in popularity amongst civilian nobles as time went on, was to completely rely on provosts for urban centers and village chiefs for rural holdings. This was the economically superior option, as bureaucrats had no martial obligations and they were paid a salary. Provosts did not have itinerant courts, instead employing bureaucratic offices in urban centers that villagers had to travel to instead. The former administration of Iranthal, which was headed by Mayor Panasoli Retnmuir, was an example of this style of governance. Overhead costs were minimized and nearly all taxes went straight to the lord. Doing so, however, not only distanced the lord from his vassals, but was also strategically stupid. As far as Ludmilla could tell, what facilitated this strategically stupid decision was the existence of the Adventurer Guild. Through the guild, a noble could contract powerful individuals on a temporary basis instead of needing to maintain the cost of a professional armed retinue. As the interior of Riestais was relatively safe from raids and attacks from demi-humans, magical beasts, and monsters, many saw no need for knights. Adventurers also had a characteristic delay to them. A threat had to be recognized, runners sent to the nearest Adventurer Guild branch and a request commissioned. Once that was done, all one could do was wait, hoping that there was a qualified adventurer party available and that they wouldn't take too long to act. How many tenants a territory lost was dependent on luck and timing. The grim reality was that it was affordable in all aspects. If villages were depopulated while waiting for adventurers, there were always spares from other places desperate for tenancy. Adventurers were similarly disposable. What wasn't disposable was the land itself, and the slain theocracy quietly dealt with threats strong enough to ruin the land or forcefully displace human populations. As a result, the economically superior option thrived. This led to the true damage, the broad breakdown of martial tradition and greatly weakened military forces. The professional retinues that took generations to cultivate were lost at the stroke of a pen in favor of greater revenues and lower operational overhead. Civilian nobles grew increasingly ignorant of the real threats that faced humanity and the gap in power between civilians and professional combatants. Many believed that levies drawn from their expendable civilian population was sufficient if military force was required. Not all nobles were so foolish, however. Many still kept knights, though that might have been primarily for prestige and thus produced warriors of lower quality. Martial nobles like the late Marquis Bollope not only had knights but raised a standing professional army out of his civilian population. Each of those soldiers was roughly equivalent to a veteran imperial knight. Like the imperial knights, this professional army was financed through taxation. Unlike the imperial knights, those who served with distinction were not added to the ranks of the gentry. Another major difference from the imperial army was that Bolop's forces did not have the combined arms approach of the imperial army and was notably deficient in mages, clerics and air cavalry. While well known as a civilian noble, Marquis Revan used a portion of his revenues to maintain a powerful professional army as well. He also kept a retinue of retired orichalcum adventurers. The fact that he reportedly ruled the most stable, progressive and generally prosperous realm in Riastais was proof that civilian nobles could do as well if not better than martial nobles with the right approach to territorial management. It was at this point of domain development that the popular tales of powerful high lords and kings with courts located in lavish palaces and expansive chateaux became a reality. High nobles held court in their capital with the many nobles, knights and councillors who assisted with the daily operations of their domain. Feasts and various other demonstrations of wealth, power and prestige were held regularly in these locations because they held court with important people regularly. In the Sorceress Kingdom, new realities essentially replaced the machinery of manorial governance and upgraded it into an entirely different beast. Conventions were scrambled, uprooted or both. At the village level, Lord Mayor's magic boosted productivity to such a degree that every harvest was guaranteed to have a surplus. Worries over famine and weather-driven catastrophes were rendered non-existent. Processing facilities such as mills were gradually being converted into ones that utilized soul eaters and death warriors. Everyone could handily afford basic necessities, and the increased revenue made possible improvements to a domain that one could only dream of before. The downside was that everyone also still held tenant contracts that were determined using old conventions. Restructuring tenancies was next to impossible without a tenant committing a major felony and having their contract justifiably revoked. This made skeleton labor somewhat pointless as it was excess labor. Not that this was a problem, there was a severe skeleton shortage anyway. Changes to how territorial administrations were run magnified the changes in industry. The transition to the new systems was exemplified in Corlin County. The towns along the highway in Corlin County were not only placed to service merchant traffic, but act as administrative hubs for their respective regions. Every village in the county was less than an hour away from the closest town by Solita. Those with issues that could not be resolved by their village chief went to the local town. These issues were then delivered to Castle Corlin, where Clara would personally deal with each. Corlin County had 14 baronies. Put another way, she had roughly 5,000 square kilometers of land to manage. One village worked roughly 60 square kilometers of land, meaning that Clara had around 80 villages to oversee and 3 towns on top of that. A single noble managing that much territory in Riastais was absolutely impossible. That she could do so by using elder lich administrators gave Clara an unheard of degree of financial and industrial clout through which she could enact the sweeping changes she wished for in her domain. She was a countess that had the economic power of a duchess, and that power would only grow. Clara's educational initiatives would turn village chiefs into proper magistrates. Provosts and highly qualified human staff produced by her institutions would be stationed in every town and eventually take over the everyday affairs that she was currently handling. Once she was free from those tasks, she could focus all of her time and energy on even greater things. The other nobles in the Sorceress Kingdom were following Clara's example and imitating the way that she did things, so life for nobles in the Sorceress Kingdom had taken a distinct turn for the better. Administrations were far more accessible, subjects could voice their issues without needing to wait for itinerant courts to arrive, and everyone as a whole was better connected. The House of Lords, which convened once per season in Riastais, could convene once a week in the Sorceress Kingdom. With improved centralization and their burgeoning finances, the aristocracy was hungry for new opportunities. A noble could handle territorial matters while their consort went to the city to make connections and negotiate for their houses, or vice versa. With the speed of transport, both could go to sleep in the same bed every night. She supposed that House Valkenheim was doing just that. In the future, spares would instead become cadets, as every house could now afford to invest resources into all of their children. Those cadets could go on to become the ambassadors, diplomats, judges, military officers, bureaucrats and other officials of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. This was what Clara foresaw, at any rate. With this idea in mind, they toiled to raise the institutions required to raise professionals of the highest possible standard. At the same time, they blazed the trails that their juniors would follow into the wide world. As Ludmilla's steps approached the central boulevard, the sound of sparring sounded off the street. She peeked past a small crowd of onlookers to the open exercise hall where 24 adventurers trained. Why is your shield so far to the side? Maybe we should save everyone the trouble and feed you to the trolls in the demi-human quarter? The rest of us can divide the coin and enjoy some ice cream. Ludmilla smiled at the sound of Alessia's scathing commentary. The tanks in the Adventurer Guild were probably thriving under her guidance. She snuck by the spectators to take a seat inside. A voice came from the bench to her left. "Excuse me, miss. Civilian spectators can't be in here." The voice came from a ranger with a silver tag dangling around his neck. He was an unfamiliar face. With the guild's ever-improving training regimen, however, it wasn't a surprise to see new members rising to that rank within 2 months. "That's right," a cold voice said from behind her. "Just because you're a noble doesn't mean you can walk in like you own a place. I figured you'd still be sifting through piles of rubble in some dark place." "How?" "Nah," the rogue replied. "We got a few more teams now, so they're rotating us till we have enough for another expedition group. I'm sick of dwarf anything at this point anyway. Welcome back, Zaradnik." Zaradnik. The ranger frowned, as in the weapon master. Thus far, the Sorceress Kingdom's Adventurer Guild only had 2 weapon masters. The first was Ludmilla, who specialized in polearms. The second was Alessia, who specialized in shield and warhammer. They needed others, but weapon masters were extraordinarily difficult to come by. It didn't help that polearms were unpopular with the adventurers, so most of Ludmilla's work consisted of pretending to be a goblin or whatever else might use something like a polearm against expedition members. The pointy stick master, How said. "You're lucky you're a bow guy or she'd punt you into the street." "Well, she might do it anyway." Ludmilla rose from the bench, turning to look at How. The rogue now sported a platinum tag and his equipment had seen a few upgrades since she had last seen him. "I must wonder what strange tales you people have been spreading since I've been away." "Nothing but the truth," How replied, "which is stranger than anything believable that we can come up with. I still blame you for the turtles, by the way." "How were they my fault?" "You're the one that turned the whole trap thing into a competition. You should see all the nasty shit people are coming up with these days." "She's the reason why the traps are so crazy?" the ranger asked. "Yeah," How nodded, "and now she serves in a party leader position so she doesn't have to deal with all that crap. Damn slippery nobles." She shifted in discomfort as the 2 scouts peered suspiciously at her. Things just happened to turn out that way, it wasn't as if she had planned it. A dull clunk sounded from the practice area, accompanied by a sympathetic groan from the spectators. A tall man in plate armor landed on the floor and rolled over with a whimper. "Demeanor." Alessia's cheerful voice rolled over the fallen fighter as she came to join them. "You are." The paladin of Sursana stopped to follow the stares of several adventurers nearby. She wiped away the crimson smear on her shield with the end of her scapula. Ludmilla fished out a trooper's towel, holding it out to Alessia. "For you, Sister Alessia," she said. "Something I picked up in the Empire." Alessia received the magic item, examining it for a moment before activating its magic. The sweat, grime and abundant bloodstains about her person vanished, leaving her pristine silver and black scapula atop polished mithril plate. "Oh, a souvenir from the savage lands of heresy," she smiled. "Thank you for your kind gift, Demeanor. Are these new there? If so, they are only 4 centuries behind the theocracy." "I am not sure," Ludmilla replied. "I never thought to ask. We have imported a large shipment of them, so, hopefully, people will take advantage of the convenience." "Are we getting those for free?" How asked, "or do we have to buy them?" "That's up to Guildmaster Reinsack," Ludmilla answered. "I only bought a few, the rest were bought up by other nobles to import." Ludmilla looked past Alessia. Nearly everyone was looking in their direction. "Sister Alessia," she said, "I think they are waiting for you to continue." "Yes, now that they have convinced one of the bards to stick around instead of earning money around the city, they can take more beatings." Come to think of it, I have not fought you before." "I only came by to drop off a few things," Ludmilla said. "Speaking of which, you have a martial art with holy attributes, yes?" "I do, Demeanor," Alessia nodded. "Why do you ask?" "Did you have much trouble figuring it out?" Ludmilla asked, adding energy damage to martial arts is a weird leap for me. Alessia pursed her lips, tapping the head of her warhammer against a greave. What have you been trying to do? Learn the Dragon Fang Thrust series in the Imperial Spearmanship School. I think it is easier for us to start with negative or holy energy attacks, Alessia said. I have a number of both. A paladin with negative energy attacks. If she told a cleric of the four about it, they would probably scream. Is there a reason for those two in particular? We are adherents of Sursana, after all, Alessia shrugged. We become adherents of a god not because we choose them, but because they are the gods we are already closest to. They resonate with our souls. Martial arts are drawn from deep within ourselves, so it stands to reason that the easiest martial arts to develop are those closest to us in character. That is a good point, Ludmilla nodded. Reading the Imperial manuals fixated me on the elemental attacks that they had. You have given me a few dozen ideas already, thank you, Sister Alessia. Ludmilla left the exercise hall, following the main promenade to the Adventurer Guild headquarters. Renovations to the interior appeared to be complete and the corridors were swept clean of dust and debris. The door to the Guildmaster's office was open and she found Pluton Einsack sitting at his desk, leaning over what looked like an expedition report. She lightly knocked on the doorframe and the Guildmaster looked up from his reading. Zaradnik, he said, you're back. For a while, at least, Ludmilla replied. I've brought you some things from the Empire, Guildmaster Einsack. Me? Well, they're more for the guild. Ludmilla placed a trooper's towel and a transcribed segment of the Imperial Combat Manual on the desk. The segment had a sample of how the Empire schooled its recruits in basic slashing attacks, followed by their transition to second-stage martial arts. You just cost me a month of paperwork, Einsack said. I won't be able to sit still until I see this at work. What have you put together for swordsmanship so far? Ludmilla asked. It's rough, the Guildmaster answered. Really rough. Moknij and I have worked on basic stuff for months and it's nothing like this. I don't even get what these advanced parts are saying. You're not alone on that, Ludmilla said. According to the soldiers that I've spoken to, one only understands when they're ready. A rumbling noise rose from the Guildmaster's chest as he frowned down at the manual segment. Do you understand this? As a weapon master. I get what it's trying to say, Ludmilla replied, but I wouldn't be able to perform what's on there without the proper foundations. I suspect that it's like that for all schools of combat. Swordsmen from one school may not be able to smoothly adopt the martial arts of another sword school at a glance. Well, it's a useful reference for sure, the Guildmaster said. Especially when it comes to how we should convey martial knowledge. What's the time frame for learning the basic martial arts shown here? The 6th Legion's recruits learn 3 in about half a year. Guildmaster Einsack furrowed his brow at the parchments held in his hands. Are you saying we're faster at it than the Imperial Army? They've had generations to develop this. I'm not sure whether our methods are better than theirs, Ludmilla said. The Imperial Knights mostly learn through drills. We use a combination of drills that are applied to live combat conducted on a daily basis in the adventurer training area. We'll only know if we apply these drills to our members and see how quickly they learn using our schedule. I see what you're getting at, the Guildmaster nodded. We'll give it a shot. We have swordsmen crawling out of the woodwork and this might be just the thing we need. Oh, what's this towel here for? It's a trooper's towel, a magic item that can be used to cast clean 3 times per day. With how messy expedition work is, I thought you might be interested in it. Interested, you mean to say you have more? Not me, Ludmilla shook her head. My friends snapped them up from merchants liquidating goods that were earmarked for the dissolved Imperial legions. I'm not sure if you're willing to subsidize the purchase, but our fully fledged members earn more than enough to buy them either way. I'll throw the idea out there, the Guildmaster said. You're right that these would be nice to have, but, now that we were starting to produce some results, the central administration is trying to define the value of our achievements. You mean that the budget will be contingent on the expedition results from now on? Pretty much. We still get enough to pay for salaries and operational costs, but anything beyond that is based on how valuable our work is. It does add an element of excitement to things, but some are worried that the changes may stifle growth. The part of the budget being regulated was what the Adventurer Guild used to stock magic items in their point store. Essentially, The Adventurer Guild's expeditionary findings went to the Sorcerer King. In exchange, they were provided funds to purchase magic items, and the government occasionally threw in a powerful piece of equipment to entice the adventurers. "Is the point store running out of items?" Ludmilla asked. "We have plenty of lower-rung items available," the guildmaster answered. "A few platinum-tier items have been purchased as well. No one can afford the higher stuff yet." "Well, as long as you keep point distribution in line with what you receive from the government, there shouldn't be a problem, I think." Guildmaster Ironsack snorted. "That's only reasonable from a management perspective," he said. "Fiddle around with people's incomes and they'll start screaming, points or no. For now, I think the safest bet is to keep distribution the same and hope everything balances out between dull results and exciting ones. I suppose that I'm the last person that one should consult with when it comes to adding excitement to anything." Ludmilla offered a self-deprecating smile. "Everything I do seems to be dull and regular to others. At any rate, I just came by to drop these things off before I head home in the morning. Have a good afternoon, Guildmaster." 4th day, Upper Wind Month, 1 CE. "Come here, you little." A wisp of negative energy smugly swirled away as Ludmilla followed it across the Erantal cemetery. She was wearing the magic cowl that enhanced her stealth and perception, so she was fairly certain that no one would notice the crazy woman stalking back and forth between the gnarled trees and weathered memorials. Negative energy, however, did not appear to respect her concealment. The realization that she had been absorbing negative energy during General Ray's expeditionary excursion continued to bother her long after the fact. She kept an eye out for visible traces that she could experiment with throughout her return journey, but accumulations so great that they were visible to her were relatively rare outside of places like cemeteries and battlegrounds. Ludmilla had nearly forgotten to check with the preparations to return to Warden's Vale, rushing out for a last-minute investigation as her household prepared a final few things before departure. As far as she could guess, she could only absorb the negative energy that she was responsible for, either through her territorial duties, direct actions, or the actions of those under her authority. She could hardly run around slaughtering people to check, so confirmation would have to wait. Given her portion of the task that awaited them in the Draconic Kingdom, there would be ample opportunity soon enough. Giving up her chase of the insolent wisp of negative energy, Ludmilla ceased concealing her presence and made her way to the cemetery gate. "Baroness Zaradnik," a voice drifted through the morning mist from the other side, "I feel that I have been encountering you in the cemetery far too often." Across the gate stood Themis and Alessia. They were attired for their routine duties in the city morgue, which meant that they were fully equipped for battle. Ludmilla supposed that going early in the morning to investigate her negative energy-related abilities meant that she stood a good chance of running into them on a shift change. "Vicar Aspasia," Ludmilla smiled politely. "Sister Alessia. I hope the morning finds you well." "My lady, are you dodging my comment?" Themis peered at her. "I have heard some strange stories from Sister Alessia about adherents of our merciful Lord getting a bit too interested in the dead side of things. In your case. Just so you know, Vicar, I have absolutely no interest in corpses or zombies or the like. Sister Alessia shared some of those stories from the theocracy with me too, and I think that they are disturbing, to say the least." Clara had been on a pilgrimage to the divine capital of the slain theocracy, but she never mentioned anything of what Alessia's stories had contained. Ludmilla was vaguely aware of the escalated zealotry in their southern neighbor, but Alessia's tales were just bizarre. From all the things that she told Ludmilla about, one might think the paladins of Sursana spent more time chasing adherents of Sursana around than anything else. While undoubtedly the most advanced, well-developed and powerful human nation in the region, the theocracy was still limited economically by the fact that labor revolved around the work of men and animals. These economic limitations meant that limitations to social infrastructure were also present. Education was superior to the empire, but the theocracy could still only afford a very basic practical education to its citizens. Religious education was an ongoing effort facilitated by the temples during sermons and consultations. Since the effectiveness of this post-primary education was dependent on whether people paid attention or not, it could lead to some dubious beliefs and practices. At least some degree of folk knowledge was pervasive throughout the slain theocracy. This was exacerbated by the zealotry of the citizens, which made for some alarming results. For instance, many in the theocracy believed that summoned angels were messengers of the gods. This was no more true than summoned demons being real demons or summoned undead being the same as naturally manifested undead, which many in the theocracy believed, too, but the belief was continually reinforced by the passing around of this folk knowledge and next to impossible to uproot. Upon hearing this, Themis voiced a desire to go on a trip to the theocracy border. There, she would summon an angel over one of the villages to see what would happen. Ludmilla, however, threatened to have a death knight follow her around for the rest of her life if she didn't swear that she wouldn't do that. It is probably not that bad, Themis said. Sister Alessia just loves talking about the most outrageous things that she has seen. Ludmilla's gaze shifted over to the paladin in question, then frowned slightly at her uncharacteristically listless expression. Did something happen? Ludmilla asked. She, got into something like a fight, Themis answered. She helps with adventurer combat training, Ludmilla said. She always gets into something like a fight. They both looked at Alessia, who only sighed. Actually, Themis said, tell me what you think about this. If Sister Alessia always dropped off her equipment for maintenance with a local armorsmith, how would you feel about that? That sounds perfectly normal to me, Ludmilla replied. There must be something more to that. I meant any maintenance, my lady. Not just repairs, but cleaning, polishing, minor things. I do that as well, Ludmilla said. Though I do not have daily opportunities to do so. There is always an apprentice that could use the work. Exactly. Alessia suddenly shouted, why can those blockheads not understand that? I have never before equated the heresy to actual stupidity, but now I think that it is all that it is. Ludmilla stared as the young paladin fumed. Themis put an arm over Alessia's shoulder, giving her a half-hug. I do not see how this becomes a fight over equipment maintenance, Ludmilla said. Well, some of the other adventurers told her she was wasting money. Oh. That was bad. That was very bad. What did Sister Alessia say? Sister Alessia said nothing, Sister Alessia sniffed. But they keep saying it. They always suggest that I should do it myself if I wanted it so much, but that is not the point. I am not a thief. After 2 months of it happening every day, at least Sister Alessia did not kill that filthy heretic. 2 months was surprising considering Alessia's generally low tolerance for things that she found foolish. Ludmilla crossed her arms, looking up into the morning gloom. Like many followers of the Six in the Sorceress Kingdom, Alessia privately believed that the Sorcerer King was Sursana. Since the Adventurer Guild was a government agency and the head of the government was the Sorcerer King, telling Alessia, an adventurer and thus an employee of the Sorcerer King, that she was wasting money was essentially telling her that she was wasting or embezzling her god's money. This was an utterly horrific assertion and Ludmilla wasn't certain how she would have reacted in Alessia's place. This wasn't the only barb, however. Followers of the Six were not only encouraged to focus on their vocations, but it was an inherently generous faith. Alessia was in the enviable position of having a set of good magic equipment and she also earned a significant amount as an Orichalcum rank adventurer. By going every day to have her armor serviced, she was helping an apprentice grow in their craft and support their livelihoods. In all, saying that Alessia was wasting money was tantamount to accusing her of not only misappropriating her god's money, but also turned her acts of charity into acts of selfish indulgence. Furthermore, they told her to go against the tenets of her faith not only by depriving apprentices of vocational experience, but telling her to maintain her own armor when ready alternatives were available. That Sister Alessia did not kill that filthy heretic after 2 months of extraordinarily hurtful insults and layers of blasphemy was a testament to how much patience the young paladin had. What happened after that? Ludmilla asked. Did the guildmaster say anything? She was told to take a break, Themis answered. I could not leave her alone so I took a break too. To perform more duties. Not quite, my lady, the vicar looked away slightly. The other clerics of Sursana have paladins to escort them now so we are rotating duties. We sort of wandered over here to see if we could find some skeletons to bash. Ludmilla looked at Sister Alessia again. Maybe some time in less hostile lands would pick her up. What about the Katza Plains? Ludmilla suggested. They have formed those new exercise areas there, or you could come to Warden's Vale. Alessia looked up at her. Eh? Really? We can go to your place, Domina? I suppose that depends on how long this break is. Guildmaster Ironsack did not say, Alessia said. We should go while we have the chance. We can perform some services there, too, Themis said. Ludmilla looked over at her. Eh? Really? That sounds really strange coming from you, my lady, Themis smirked. But why not? I am your cleric and Bishop Hostine would not likely retain us. Then it is settled, Ludmilla smiled. We have not had temple staff in Warden's Vale since the annexation. The people will be ecstatic when they see you. Themis and Alessia went to pack their things and Ludmilla returned to her manor. A carriage was already loaded for the journey and Amelia stood in front of the gate between the two Death Knights looking out for her return. Lutzi, Ludmilla said, there's been a slight change of plans. What might that be, my lady? 2 guests will be coming along with us, Ludmilla replied. We'll pick them up at the main plaza on the way out. Yes, my lady, Amelia bobbed her head. Should I send ahead to have accommodations prepared? One of the empty homes near us in the village square should do. Amelia went into the manor to deliver a message to Warden's Vale. 5 minutes later, they were on the way out of the central district, arriving in the main plaza as the morning markets were beginning to pick up. They stopped near the cathedral and Amelia stared as the right door opened and she saw who the guests were. Oh? Alessia said, Miss Lutzi is here too. I often forget that she is the demeanor's maid. I suppose you do see her more often as an acolyte, Ludmilla said. What did His Excellency the Bishop say about your trip? He said huh? Alessia replied, I left before the rest. He was fine with it, Themis rolled her eyes, everything is taken care of. I heard it was over a day by ship so it seems like quite the adventure. Themis had been in the vicinity of Warden's Vale so Ludmilla wasn't sure why she would consider it an adventure. The training expeditions for the Adventurer Guild were held in the forests around her territory. That will change starting today, Ludmilla said. New ships are operating on the Katza River. We will be taking the first voyage there. I did not know it was such a special occasion. Themis shifted in her seat and straightened her vestments. I hope this is not an imposition. Not at all, Ludmilla replied. The ships are rather large so we can all fit. The wagon slowed as they entered the morning queue to depart the city. Amelia fidgeted quietly beside Ludmilla. Is something the matter, Lutzi? Ah, no, maybe. I almost feel that I should not be sitting in the same carriage. Nonsense, Ludmilla said. You are my lady's maid. If I am working in a civilian setting, you should be right there with me. Besides, Themis is being attended to by Alessia, I am being attended by you. That seems right, does it not? If you put it that way, yes, my lady. I apologize for saying something so strange. Themis and Alessia stared quietly at Amelia. She started fidgeting again. Ludmilla frowned at them. Why are you staring at Lutzi like that? It never ceases to amaze me how she transforms, Themis said. She becomes an entirely different person from the one we see attending classes. Oh? Ludmilla raised an eyebrow. What is she like? Fervent, Alessia said. Sister Alessia. Amelia protested. Now she was curious. With Amelia devoting so much of her time to both her duties and her studies, Ludmilla thought it best to give her some space and not pry into her affairs. What do you mean by fervent? How do you say, just very demeanor? Bam? What she means to say, my lady, Themis explained, is that Miss Lutzi has plenty of zeal for everything. She is especially lively when she talks about you. Amelia hid her face in her hands. Ludmilla was divided between leaving the matter be and pushing to find out more. Does that make her a good student? She asked. I guess it does, Themis answered. She might be the only one that manages to stay awake through Brother Werrell's lectures. I could not last 10 minutes against those. Now that they were on the topic of Amelia's studies, Ludmilla recalled a number of questions that had gone unanswered since her lady's maid started training as an acolyte. Have you had maids trained to be divine casters before? She asked. Not at all, Themis answered. The reason why she wanted to become an acolyte seemed reasonable enough, so we thought it would not hurt to try. She wanted to learn divine magic to become a better maid, with several of His Majesty's maids being powerful casters. It seems like a given now, but back then it did sound a bit strange. So back then you did not think it went against the scriptures? At a cursory glance it does, the vicar said. We are used to maids performing a certain range of duties, and those expectations can end up dictating our views as to what is proper and pious conduct. But these expectations are ultimately our expectations and not those of the gods. The scriptures do have examples of proper practices in production-type vocations, but a maid is not a production-type vocation. They can cook and mend, Ludmilla noted. Ah, but that is something everyone can do, Themis replied. To an extent, and that extent is tangible. The products of true artisans are of distinctly higher quality than those produced through mundane effort, so to speak. A maid is a service vocation that essentially carries out a variety of mundane tasks for noble households. They do require the training appropriate to their position and that of the nobles who they serve, but they also exhibit no special skills or abilities as other vocations do. Themis did have a point about that. While they could be suspiciously astute about certain things and could seemingly detect work, her investigations on the maid job class and its capabilities identified nothing that could be considered an ability or a skill. Maids, and their manservant equivalents, above a certain rank in a household were usually nobles anyway. Which brings us to the question, Themis continued, raising a finger, what is the essence of being a maid? Society has formed perceptions of what a maid is, but even those perceptions differ. To commoners, a maid is seen as one who performs menial labor for noble households, and most commoner maids had similar working conditions. They become scullery maids, laundresses, still-room maids and other types of between staff. To nobles, a maid is a position of honor and prestige. Those who secure positions as senior household staff in a high lord's household have more de facto power and influence than most regular nobles. Some might also say that members of a household's senior staff are effectively officers of a noble's retinue. I have given some consideration to those lines of thought over the last year, Ludmilla nodded. But if we are to reconstruct what it means to be a maid or a footman, how would it work? Does it mean that they should be able to develop skills and abilities as other vocations do? Where do the boundaries lie between a household servant and other vocations? Rather than imagining hard boundaries that separate vocations from one another, the vicar said, I believe it is more accurate to say that a vocation is an idea. It is the idea that encompasses what the vocation entails, and those ideas may cause some vocations to overlap in some areas with others. This might not happen too often out in the territories, but, as a member of the city's clergy, our faithful often request consultation about whether they are doing the right thing or not. With its many disparate vocations, a city would indeed have many of the overlaps that Themis spoke of. An armorsmith, blacksmith, jeweler and weaponsmith all performed similar tasks in pursuit of their craft. So too did leatherworkers and tailors, or the various woodworking professions. The recent incident with Alessia showed overlaps between combat and artisan vocations as well. A fighter or a paladin could perform basic maintenance of their equipment, but that basic maintenance was also performed by artisans of the relevant craft. This overlap also caused confusion when people from certain backgrounds filled certain roles. Their current focus of maids was an excellent example of this. They overlapped with something in essentially everything that they did. Common maids in junior positions performed menial labor that anyone could perform. The difference was that these commoners were required to possess a bare minimum of training and knowledge in aristocratic affairs. Noble women who entered a household as a maid employed their aristocratic education, but their maid education was in the exact opposite direction of a commoner's maid education. Everything that they learned had to do with what commoners considered common sense when it came to menial labor and personal relations. Additionally, there were things that maids did that artisans also did, such as cooking and a certain degree of tailoring that came with household chores. Combined with Ludmilla's knowledge of job classes, or what Themis termed an idea, this created a rather broad picture as to what the maid job class could do. What was a part of it? What wasn't? A few things could be confidently crossed off the list, but most couldn't. Nobles were in a similar situation, possessing a broad skill set that allowed them to fill many positions. Many of these skills were not everyday skills, however. A noble had substantial diplomatic knowledge and skill. If they became a diplomatic official, did they continue to gain job class levels as a noble, or as a diplomat? Would a noble employing their administrative skills as a bureaucrat grow as a noble or as a bureaucrat? If a martial noble became an officer in the army, did they grow as a martial noble or gain captain and commander job class levels? Was there a limit to the number of job class levels one could have in a specific job class? If so, where did all the excess experience go? This was less of a question than the preceding musings, however. According to the ongoing investigations by the Adventurer Guild and the central bureaucracy, the limit for the average citizen was somewhere around level 15, with individuals becoming rarer the further one drifted from that point. As such, making the most of what one had was of more immediate importance to the citizens of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. So you mean to say that the idea behind a vocation is the best indicator of whether one is doing the right thing or not?
I do, Themis nodded. I believe this is the reason why our scriptures tend to only provide loose examples to illustrate how guidelines are observed. Using absolute examples would stifle the development of the faithful, preventing us from realizing the full potential of our place in life.
I see. Then how do you reconcile Amelia's decision to become an acolyte? His Majesty having highly specialized maids serves as evidence that such paths can be viable, but how do we frame things in a more technical sense that can be applied to personal development?
Grasping how job classes were framed was not only key to personal development, but domain development as well.
Her current processes generally revolved around facilitating the growth of her employees and tenants by providing what they needed not just to survive off of their contracts, but to thrive. People had the discretionary income to enjoy a more than comfortable standard of living, which included their entertainment expenses and the pursuit of personal projects. Followers of the Six tended to pursue vocational development as a hobby when resources were available, so it was Ludmilla's hope that her policies would lead to breakthroughs in job class development. Those breakthroughs would be added to her expanding library of knowledge and incorporated into vocational education. So far, this library consisted of existing knowledge codified into a form that framed everything into the concept of job class levels. Breakthroughs were likely slow in the making. She had no expectation of anything happening in less than a year, at any rate.
Amelia has actually been instrumental when it comes to exploring that question.
Themis smiled at the maid. Some of my thoughts on her development are a bit unconventional, but the fact that I can reasonably arrive at certain conclusions is remarkable in itself.
The carriage finally passed through the southern gate of Rantel, passing between the two towering statues of the Sorcerer King.
Their progress accelerated for but a brief moment before reaching the tail of a long line of wagons.
Ludmilla opened the window and peeked ahead.
It appeared that traffic was stuck following behind a merchant caravan from the Empire, which still employed draft animals. The rest of the road was filled with wagons waiting to get into the gate, so they were good and stuck until they could pass the caravan ahead.
Ludmilla closed the window and sat back down, shaking her head.
Traffic regulations were an ongoing challenge in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Even after expanding the highway, some people thought that an open lane on the road was free for anyone to use. For every merchant informed of the new laws, another one arrived who was ignorant of them or thought that regulations were for other people.
Rantel's municipal government was more than happy to extract fines from offenders, so, hopefully, the problem would mostly vanish at some point.
You would think that traffic regulations being enforced by elder liches would be deterrent enough, Ludmilla muttered.
You were saying, Vicar Aspasia?
Oh. Miss Lutzi is very made in her approach to magic, my lady. The spells that she learns are not the same spells that the acolytes training to be clerics and priests learn. Not in the sense that they can't learn them, but the theme that they follow.
With maid being the theme.
Just so, Themis nodded. She focuses on the spells that one might think a maid would learn if they had magic. Clean might be the first thing that comes to mind, but there are entire processes incorporated into her learning. To draw a bath for their mistress, a regular maid will prepare a fire, retrieve water, heat the water while tending to the fire and then add it to a bathtub. They will repeat the process for as long as necessary. After their mistress is done, they have to carry the used water back out to dispose of. Amelia, on the other hand, casts create water to fill the tub, temperature change to alter it to a suitable temperature, then destruction water to dispose of it. She has converted the task of drawing a bath from a mundane process to a magical one.
But it was my instructors that taught me each spell,
Vicar Aspasia, Amelia said.
And they know the process themselves. I am not doing anything new.
Themis nodded, smoothly rendering a reply as if expecting the lady's maid to say as much.
This may seem like a strange distinction, the vicar said, but knowing is not the same as doing.
The broad thematic elements behind what you cast and why are also fundamentally different from that of other acolytes. Most acolytes manage their mana as members of the temple staff and continue this style of mana management into their professional careers. All of the nuances behind Miss Lutzie's progress and intent lead me to suspect that she is not an acolyte at all. Ludmilla furrowed her brow at Themis' postulation. As far as she knew, those who went to train as acolytes either succeeded at becoming one or, as was in Ludmilla's case, did not. She had never heard of anything that suggested that they might become something else entirely. Could you expand on your suspicions, Vicar Aspasia? Ludmilla asked. Lutzie is a faithful follower of the Six. Why would she not become an acolyte? I am not implying that she is some sort of infidel, Themis answered. Miss Lutzie is as faithful as they come for common urbanites. It goes back to what Sister Alessia said about her just now. The BAM? The BAM, Themis nodded. You see, there are 4 broad categories of tier magic. Divine magic is the practice of magic through personal faith or belief in something greater than oneself. Clerics and priests, for instance, either believe in divine beings or philosophical paths. Those from the far south who follow the Buddha do not worship a being known as the Buddha, but instead follow the path of enlightenment and derive their ability to cast divine magic through its observance. She thought she might see such followers of the Buddha, who referred to themselves as monks in the empire, but had no luck. They reportedly had a strange mode of dress, as well. Other types of divine casters include druids, who draw from the power of nature, and those we might call shamans or spiritualists, who derive power from ancestor worship, nature spirits and animal totems. We have had plenty of interactions with them, with all the demi-humans coming into the city, and they all appear to be druids, yet they make a specific distinction between those vocations. Learning why is an ongoing study, but it still carries the notion that ideas or themes are central to their establishment. Most of the divine casters in the Sorceress Kingdom were such individuals, so Ludmilla was familiar enough with them. Arcane magic is cast through structure and force of will, Themis continued. Wizards and sorcerers are examples of this. Sometimes people think them more studious or academic than practitioners of other categories of magic, but that is an erroneous perception rooted in the Empire's institutions. The theocracy's institutions are just as academic and mostly focus on divine magic. The third broad category is the spiritual magic, which is not to be confused with the shaman and spiritualists who are divine casters. Geomancers, talismancers, yin-yang and 5-element practitioners are some of the examples that you might know. They are highly ritualistic, but their ritualization of magic is to the degree that it can be conducted quickly by a single person or even crafted onto tokens, much like how we can create scrolls for later use. Ludmilla had no idea about any of that. At best she had only heard of the things described in passing. Since it was so rare as to be unheard of in the region, the focus of her studies went to other categories of magic. The final category of tier magic has no official name, Themis said, as it is more to encompass what is left over. This is where I believe Amelia's magic casting is founded. You see, despite being associated with religion, paladins also fall into this category. The foundation of a paladin's magic is not faith, but service. These are loosely seen as oaths and can be in service to various things. One might swear to be a defender of the faith, as Alessia has. One could also swear an oath of poverty, conquest, vengeance, allegiance or countless other things. Like those insane heretics who swear oaths of chastity, Alessia muttered. Like that, Themis shuddered. The point is that service is the root of power for paladins. To turn from that service is to fall and lose their powers. In Amelia's case, she is not driven to become a spellcaster because of her faith, but because of her desire to serve her mistress. So you're saying that rather than being an acolyte, Ludmilla said, Amelia is a squire? Themis leaned back in her seat, raising her hands in a shrug. Squires cannot cast magic until they are ordained as paladins, though they can use magic items to cast. She also cannot rightly be called an acolyte. Amelia is something else, which is quite exciting. Discoveries like this are rare. So Amelia is something that is different from acolytes and squires, but what can that something do? That is something that we have to investigate, Themis said. If she is indeed her own sort of apprentice type, the only thing we have to go on is the idea of a maid that can cast magic. Most of it revolves around a universal discipline of magic called lifestyle magic. Communication, temperature control, conjuring food, water, paper and spices, cleaning and maintaining things. On that note, there was something we noticed about her spells. Amelia, when you cast summon spices, how much do you conjure? 110 grams. Themis gave Ludmilla a pointed look. Ludmilla nodded. Summoned spices produced 100 grams of spices in a single cast. To produce more. Does that mean she has some sort of conjuration specialization?
Ludmilla asked. Not quite, Themis answered.
Her clean and change temperature spells also cover a wider area or otherwise do more relative to our other acolytes casting them. She appears to have a lifestyle magic specialization.
That's very, maid?
See what I mean? Themis smirked.
When you think about things that way, the world makes a lot more sense than with the narrow definitions that we tend to use.
In her own way, Themis was speaking of class levels.
As far as Ludmilla knew, no one had shared the knowledge of their existence with the vicar.
She had come up with a loose theory based on her experiences and observations as a cleric, as well as her analysis of their religious doctrines. A part of Ludmilla preferred Themis' more natural interpretation, which was strangely in line with how Elishnish saw the world. Rather than observing boundaries, they explored possibilities. A danger existed in doing so, however, one that led to irrevocable harm. It was entirely possible that the idea one had was wrong and they ended up with build contamination. As attractive as pursuing a world of limitless possibilities was, she could not do so recklessly and risk hurting others.
So Miss Lutzi is potentially not an acolyte, Alessia mused, nor is she a squire. What would she be called?
Male scions of aristocratic houses sometimes apprenticed under other houses as pages, exchanging labor for education and practical experience. Common boys similarly apprenticed in aristocratic households as knaves. When their education was complete, they could become footmen, butlers or other respected positions of service and stewardship. Male scions could return to their houses to assume duties there. There was, however, no equivalent for women. They were all simply different types of maids holding different ranks in a noble household.
That is the most exciting part, Themis grinned.
She is probably a maid.
I do not think there was anything funny in your breakfast. I mean it.
The vicar dug her elbow into her attendant's armored side.
Look at it this way,
a squire or acolyte is essentially an apprentice with immature or undeveloped abilities compared to their master. A maid is similar in the sense that they are mostly mundane in their vocation, immature or undeveloped, if you will. But a maid does not become anything more than a higher-ranked maid, Ludmilla noted. Unless they accept an engagement or return to their families for various reasons. That is correct, but you are missing one important thing: the master is always first a novice. Remember that we only attach labels to these vocations, they exist whether we name them or not. Some demi-human countries on the other side of the world might call them something else entirely. Just as a squire is what it is regardless of what we call it, so too does this apply to everything else. If we consider it that way, it may be that the maid we are familiar with is the apprentice and the true master - a fully fledged maid that is as different as squires and acolytes are to paladins and clerics, already exists, but is not yet recognized as such. Themis' excited breathing filled the carriage as she came to her conclusion. Ludmilla exchanged looks with Amelia. The Sorcerer King already had all manner of magic casting maids, so why not?